Philosophy News Podcast. I'm Paul Party, your host and publisher of the Philosophy News website, your resource for the latest in philosophy. Our website address is philosophynews.com, where you can read the latest news on philosophy as well as stimulating articles on a variety of philosophical topics. You can also find other resources on this podcast and comment on today's episode. Our email address is mail@philosophynews.com. We'd love to hear from you. Today is December 3rd, 2011, and my guest today is Peter Boghossian of Portland State University, who, in addition to his teaching responsibilities at the university, has been doing fascinating work with prisoners, teaching on things like critical thinking and moral reasoning. Peter is also the chairman of the Prison Advisory Committee for Columbia River Correctional Institution. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks for having me.
One of the fundamental virtues of philosophy, it seems to me, is its ability to help us to become better thinkers. And then, similarly, when it comes to philosophy instruction, philosophy professors tend to focus on giving their students the tools that they can use to think rigorously really about any subject. One way to capture this idea, some people put it this way, is to say that philosophy teaches us how to think rather than what to think. Peter, you stated in a recent article for the journal Inside Higher Ed, an article we've linked to, by the way, on our website, that this approach may not be entirely correct. You wrote, "I believe our role as educators should be to teach students not just factual data, but the importance of critically examining beliefs by exposing them to facts, and then revising cherished notions when confronted with reliable but discomforting evidence. In other words, we should have as a primary goal that of changing students' minds." At least that's how I read your article. Can you talk a little bit about your thesis and what you were after there?
Sure, I'm happy to. Many educators are petrified of telling students that they're wrong or that the conclusions that they've come to are incorrect. This is less so in the hard sciences and more so in the hermeneutical sciences, philosophy being one of those. I argue that there are certain processes of reasoning that are better than other processes of reasoning. But if somebody uses an unreliable process to attempt to come to a conclusion, instructors and educators, especially if it's in the realm of faith, won't call them out on it, won't say, hey, wait a minute. I teach a class knowledge, rationality, and understanding. And sometimes students from who take it in other sections come in and they'll say something to me to the extent of, well, I had this question about this or God or, transubstantiation, the Eucharist, what have you. These things are elephants in the room. It's almost impossible to not meaningfully discuss these issues unless you're willing to talk about the process that one uses, the fact that certain processes are unreliable to get one to lead one to the truth, faith being one of those processes, and to have educators call people out on, quite frankly, delusions.
So you're definitely focusing on process here. But in your article, you seem to talk about wanting to give your students facts. In other words, you want them to leave your classroom knowing what the truth is rather than just providing them with a framework or a method for getting to the truth. How do you reconcile those two?
Process is absolutely indispensable. And so we know that there are certain processes that are more likely to lead one to true conclusions than other processes. Flipping coins, not reliable. Sacrificing goats, not reliable. Science, hypothesis testing, very reliable. That doesn't mean that all conclusions that come about as a result of a scientific process are true. It just means that they're more reliable than conclusions that don't come about as a result of a scientific process, particularly when empirical claims about the world are at stake. And so many times people come in thinking that either one, that the process they're using, and it's almost always a faith-based process, that the process that they're using to arrive at their conclusions is somehow legitimate. And again, echoing my earlier comment, instructors simply will not tell people that this is incorrect. They will not say, no, that's wrong. No, that's not a reliable guide to reality.
What do philosophy professors tend to do?
Why do you think that? Or, oh, that's interesting. They tend to have a very saccharine approach rather than being very direct and very blunt and asking people or demanding what the evidence is for that.
And do you think philosophy is particularly unique when it comes to its ability to change beliefs in the way that you describe? In other words, does philosophy bring anything unique to the table when it comes to those types of conversations?
The second part of your question was different from your first. I think that the zeitgeist now is we don't want to offend people. We want to be liked. There are a whole host of reasons for this, from political reasons, professional reasons, and of course surveys, fear of administrative complaints. I don't see philosophy professors as exempting themselves from this larger social movement of nicety, diversity, everyone getting along with everybody. I think to a certain extent it's the attitudinal disposition of the instructor. Is the instructor willing to call people out on processes, on conclusions that result from processes that are themselves not reliable?
Sure.
I think that's an individual thing. I don't think that philosophy contributes more or less to that than other disciplines. I do think that philosophy itself is engaged in a critical analysis. So philosophy frequently, some disciplines, psychology, anthropology, etc., do this as well, turn the lens in and on itself. I think philosophy is in a sense unique because it allows all propositions in the discipline of philosophy to be critically examined. It grants not a privileged viewpoint, but a position from which different processes themselves can be judged. It gives the meta tools or the framework. Daniel Dennett said the job of philosophy is to turn mysteries into puzzles. To turn mysteries into puzzles. Yeah.
There seemed to be quite a reaction to the article. In fact, on Philosophy News, we got quite a bit of traffic when we linked to the article, and then I wrote a little bit of a commentary on it. And then in personal conversation, I think the phrase you used was that it went viral. What was the reaction to the piece, and how did the community respond?
Yeah, it was less the response to the article and then more a talk that I gave. I gave a talk in which we booked a room for, I think, 80, and literally hundreds of people showed up, and I can't even tell you how many we've turned away.
Yeah.
And I'm be giving another talk on January 27th about a similar talk, but it was the fact that faith is a cognitive sickness that's been turned into a moral virtue. And I talked about precisely the reasons why educators don't engage people in their faith-based delusions. I think it went viral, and I think so many people went precisely because there's a hunger for blunt, honest talk about this. And we're also petrified of not only as educators, but when someone says, I'm offended by that, or, that's a religious question, everybody throws up the white flag of surrender, as if somehow when someone says, I'm offended by that, we need to back off. But to directly answer your question, I think that it went viral because it had a catchy title, and I think that people really are hungry for an honest discourse about this, especially now with the current crop of Republicans, 4 of whom believe that they have been personally anointed by God to run for office. There's no price to be paid for that. That's outrageous.
Right. I have another question about the reaction to your speech, but something you said just caught my attention. You said something like faith-based frameworks as a way of getting to truth take on a certain moral flavor, a certain moral characteristic. And that's certainly true if you mentioned the current political climate, and that's certainly true in that whole environment. What did you mean by faith taking on a moral flavor, and how do you think that plays out?
So I think one of the things that we've seen happen, and Dennett talks about this in Breaking the Spell, and then he talks about this again in his a little article, Preachers Who Are Not Believers, that people of faith, or people who use faith as a process to know the world, think that the fact that they use this process to know the world, this is actually a moral issue for them. They think that this way of thinking, and I'm hesitant to use the word reasoning, this way of thinking about the world makes them better people. It imbues upon them a certain characteristic or quality, a moral quality. using this way of thinking is a value, and that somehow that value makes them a good person or a better person or a more just or a more humble or noble person. And the thing that's interesting about that is that everybody else fell for that. So many people fall for this idea that if somebody says that they are a person of faith, then somehow that means that they must be a good person or a decent person or a kind person, when in fact that's not true. It's just a process of reasoning that will lead one away from the truth.
And do you find the converse also true, that when you attempt to use reason to get to the bottom of something, or you provide evidence, or you come up with a philosophical argument, that there's almost a moral indignation?
I'm not sure I understood the question.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is that a lot of times what I hear from people of faith, when I attempt to use reason to try to solve problems or try to use reason to get to the truth of something, they almost have a moral indignation about that. They almost look at me like there's something going wrong there, and they say, well, if you reason to that conclusion, then what room is there for faith? And that's just not the right way to do it.
Right. It's amazing the amount of mental gymnastics that they will do to make sure that their belief system remains intact and their process of thinking about the world remains intact.
Yeah, I agree. And of course we all do that, but it's definitely, it's highlighted in those scenarios for sure.
You're right. We do this, but it's both more conspicuous in their case, and in their case, they turn this into a moral virtue. They turn the fact that they do this into, they somehow translate that into being better people themselves. And that's an illegitimate move, and that's a move that we ought not to allow people to make.
Right, and I think that's the kind of the point that you were making, sure. I have a related question. I hear a lot of times from theists, they say, well, atheists are people of faith too. They make a bunch of faith claims, and particularly people like Dawkins or Dennett, who are more prominent and more visible, they'll say something like, well, a lot of the stuff they say they have really no proof for, but they're just taking a leap of faith and they're making these claims as if they're based on evidence. What's your response to that?
I think it gets back to the idea of why so many people don't like the term, myself included, don't like the term atheist. There is no atheist epistemology. There is no atheist metaphysics. There's no atheist. There's no epistemology for people who don't believe in the Easter Bunny or Santa Claus. It's an odd notion, and I think it underscores a fundamental misunderstanding. I really do think that it's kind of, I see that in a certain sense in what Plantinga does. I think it's a misunderstanding of or a mischaracterization of a position. People seem to think it's an odd notion that there really is an atheist epistemology. There's an atheist way of looking at the world. There is no atheist epistemology. There's no common framework or way to understand reality or way to view the world among people who don't believe in the Easter Bunny. It's even thinking that is a misconceptualization or a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to be an atheist about something. And I actually don't call myself an atheist. I call myself a skeptic.
There was a famous paper by Anthony Flew where he talked about the burden of proof and whether or not what we call quote-unquote atheism is kind of a default position. In other words, who bears the burden of proof in making claims about theism? And it sounds like you would agree with his essential thesis. The theist bears the burden of proof, certainly.
You can see that very clearly, and if you watch the debates, and these are available on YouTube, particularly the debates with Hitchens and Harris and Dennett and Dawkins, and the move that we see being made on the part of the theists is that they try to switch the burden of proof. So that somehow there's this evidentiary burden on the skeptic or the atheist to somehow prove or demonstrate that God didn't create there wasn't some kind of Aristotelian first mover. And that's a totally illegitimate move. I mean, here's one way to think about it. Is it possible that the universe could have always existed? Sure. I mean, absolutely. Is it possible that God could have created the universe? Sure, it's possible. But given that we don't have enough evidence to point us in the direction of either one, why would one believe one thing rather than the other? At the very least, again, this is one way to conceptualize it. At the very least, that's a reason for agnosticism.
Yeah, I tend to agree there. I think those types of questions are so complicated and we have so little data that I think being a skeptic or being agnostic is actually the most reasonable position, particularly when you consider everything that we have to work with. So, yeah, I totally agree there.
And then it's further problematic because then people make these fantastical, just unbelievable inferences from that to their holy books being true.
Right. Did you get Thesis responding to your article and to your talk? And what kind of response did they give you? Was it antagonistic? Was it appreciative? What was the range of responses there?
That's funny. That was the shocking part. All of the theists were incredibly nice. I think that they want to help me. They want to help me to adopt a hermeneutic of charity towards faith-based systems of viewing the world. The real, not anger, not disappointment, the real bone of contention came from my secular liberal colleagues.
What was the contention?
Who are not pleased with me. Well, it's a whole range of things. One of the things I asked in the talk was if Sam Harris's question, if someone doesn't believe in evidence, what evidence can you give them to believe in evidence? If someone doesn't believe in reason, what reason can you give? And the next slide was the null slide. I showed a blank slide. You can't give them anything. And I think many of my colleagues somehow mystically believe, magically, that if you just keep exposing people to evidence, that somehow they'll then lawfully align their beliefs with reality. That's just not true. Because if it were true, that they wouldn't be in the situation that they believe in now and believing preposterous things.
Sure. So let's drill in on that a little bit because that's a really interesting point. So let's suppose someone doesn't believe that logic or evidence or philosophical argument or those types of frameworks are the way to get to the truth. How do you break through that? How do you deal with a person that's in that mental state? So, for example, if someone comes up to you and says, "I believe God told me that I'm going to be the next president of the United States, and by the way, there's nothing that you can show me or give me or present to me that would sway me from that opinion." How do you break through that? In fact, I think you gave a similar example of one of your students that wrote something like that at the end of her on her exam or on a final paper that she submitted. So how do you respond to something like that?
That's a great question. So the way to I'll directly answer your question and then I'll give some context to it. I think the first thing that you need to do as an educator is to be the American Philosophical Association's Delphi report on critical thinking. Talks about this idea that one is willing to reconsider. A willingness to reconsider. Another core component they note is a trustfulness of reason. I always attempt to model the behavior of willingness to reconsider. So I'm completely willing to reconsider any of my beliefs and jettison them as appropriate if I'm faced with evidence. Or at the very least, beliefs are we assign some kind of a confidence value to beliefs. I'm willing to reassign or reassess those confidence values on the basis of new evidence. As Carl Sagan says, the more extraordinary the claim, the more extraordinary the burden of evidence.
Yeah, and Hume said something similar in his argument against miracles.
Yeah, so the first thing is willingness to reconsider, so you have to model that behavior. The second thing is, and I think this is one reason why the many, many Christians turned out to that talk, and I have a feeling this next one is going to be particularly large as well, that the Christians are not upset. I think one of the reasons is that they not only see this idea of a willingness to reconsider, but I genuinely attempt to not create adversarial relationships. And I know that the talk sounded incendiary, but I think it's that idea that you don't create these relationships of conflicts, these win-lose relationships. In the Gorgias, Socrates says that it is better to be refuted than it is to refute. And I think that there's a profound truth to that.
Yes. But let's turn that question on its head for a second. A lot of philosophers make a distinction between what we might call subjective and objective beliefs, or between approaching the world existentially versus approaching it rationally. So suppose I come up to you and I say, I have a pain in my back, and I know that I have a pain in my back because I immediately experience it. In other words, I don't reason to it. I don't have to look at CAT scans. I don't have to ask a doctor. I just feel the pain, and I know I'm in pain. That's what we might call a subjective belief, and someone like Plantinga could argue I could be perfectly justified and rational in holding that belief. Now, there's a distinction between that and me approaching you and saying, because I have a pain in my back, you must do certain things. You must turn towards a certain city and pray 3 times a day or something, or you need to give me a certain amount of money, or whatever the request is. Would you make a distinction between those two types of beliefs?
Yeah. So the real problem with many of these claims is when people claim that their subjective experience, their personal revelation, etc., and this will dovetail back into the other reason why many of my leftist secular colleagues are upset with me. The real problem comes when those issues translate into public policy.
Yeah.
So when someone's, I don't think it's productive to use the word religious, but when someone's faith-based experience, they think, well, because of this experience, here's the tricky part. Because one can think many things because of their faith-based experience. Somehow this needs to be institutionalized as law, or others need to follow this guideline, whether it's drinking alcohol a certain number of times a day, or not drinking it, or facing a certain direction, or praying a certain number of times. Those things translate into the public policy arena, and that's what I find particularly disturbing and problematic. Now, there are objective claims and there are subjective claims. In the moral landscape, Sam Harris mentions this. Dennett mentions this as well. Sam Harris talks about having tinnitus in his ear. There are ways to measure subjective experiences that people have. The problem is that many claims that people make are actually objective claims. They're empirical claims. To piggyback on an example I used before, the Eucharist in transubstantiation, this idea that the Eucharist transforms itself literally into the body of Christ during Catholic rituals. Those are objective claims that one makes.
Yes, right. The claim appears to be a faith-based claim, and we might say non-objective or subjective claim. I believe that the Eucharist has turned to the body of Christ. But if that's an actual claim that it is the body of Christ, that appears to be testable. It appears to be objective. Obviously, a test would not show it to be human flesh, and the wine would not be human blood. But the person's making a claim as if it could be tested in that way. And then as soon as it fails the test, quote unquote, then they just say, well, it was a faith claim. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, that's right. So that claim itself, that it doesn't matter if it's a faith claim. You've made a claim that something happens. That's an empirical claim. It's testable. We can test those sorts of claims. And it doesn't matter the reason why one came to the conclusion. It's still a testable claim.
Sure. So there's a distinction between a belief that we might call public-facing, or a belief that a person has that they think has implications for everyone else, and a belief that they have that they would allow to govern their own lives, but that wouldn't have an impact on the lives of others.
That's absolutely correct. And Habermas talks about this a little bit with this idea of discursive rationality, rather than somebody sitting at home and just being in awe, that somehow that experience has to be linguistically translated in propositional format, and that gives others the possibility of looking at and examining those statements.
Got it. Alvin Plantinga is famous for making arguments along these lines. In fact, his arguments have had a tremendous amount of influence, mainly in philosophy of religion, but also in epistemology in general. And his arguments go generally like this. He says a person can be perfectly rational in believing that God exists, even if those beliefs aren't grounded on or based on evidence and arguments that we would have in the traditional sense of those terms. In fact, I recently interviewed Dr. Plantinga on his new book, the book that's coming out this winter, and that interview will be appearing on Philosophy News here pretty soon. And in that book, he continues to make those similar types of arguments. What do you think of what has been labeled Reformed epistemology?
That's a fantastic question. For the life of me, I cannot possibly understand what it seems. To again borrow Habermas, it seems like a performative contradiction. I do not understand how that could possibly be the case. It seems crystal clear to me that it's an example of someone who starts with their belief first, kind of a sophisticated form of confirmation bias, and then works backwards to that. I mean, just look at this. If nothing else, here's what we know, and you had mentioned the word religion, so I'll piggyback off of that.
Sure.
We know that from the unshakable testimony of millions of people in different religious faiths, we know that there are contradictory beliefs about what that a particular individual's God wants or it is in one's holy book. We also know that they can't all be correct.
Sure.
So then the question is, how does one know that one is correct? What tools can one use to differentiate a religious belief or a belief from a delusion? For example, is one willing to revise it? Are you willing to revise the belief you have? I've never understood Plantinga. It's possible that I'm just not getting it, but again, I don't think so. I think that it's a form of confirmation bias when he starts with his belief first and then he attempts to justify it.
So in your opinion, religious belief isn't like that subjective belief that we talked about earlier. It's not like a pain where you can have it, and even if you keep it to yourself, it's completely rational, and you can claim that it's a rational belief because you've had it in that subjective way.
I think that there are states of the mind, and increasingly we see this in neurology, for example. I think that there are states of the mind that link to experiences that one has, and that those can be articulated or translated into religious feelings or religious experiences. But again, those claims are very different from, for example, saying that Jesus Christ is the Son of God.
Right.
Or that Moses parted the Red Sea. Or that, whatever other miracles one would want to attribute.
Right. So that's a similar distinction to one that I've made in some of the writing that I've done. There seems to be a distinction between saying, I believe God exists, and God exists. The former is a subjective state about what I take to be true about the world. The latter is ostensibly objective in the sense that it's testable, and it's a statement about the way that the world actually is. So I think what you're trying to say is that there's a difference between those two things.
That's absolutely correct, yeah.
Let's take the lens out a little bit and ask the question from a slightly different angle. There's a lot of philosophers that would argue that logic and reason may not be adequate in a lot of areas for determining what the truth is about a subject matter because truth is opaque. And let's just set religion aside for a moment and just talk about knowledge in general. Cosmology might be a good example. So Bertrand Russell says the fact of the universe is just a brute fact, and we can't really answer specific questions about where it came from, the origins of the universe, questions like those. So we just have to state that it's here and leave it at that. So how would you respond to the criticism to your position that that knowledge is opaque in a lot of disciplines in a lot of areas of epistemology, and while that doesn't entail that we stop studying or we stop researching, it may mean that we have to be tentative, we have to be careful, we have to make careful statements about what we can claim to be true.
So I'll use your example first. So just because you put a question word in front of a bunch of other words doesn't make it a legitimate question.
Okay.
All right, so just because you say, does it all come from, and then you stick a where in front of it, that doesn't mean it somehow is a meaningful question. I mean, maybe there is no where it all came from. Maybe it just existed. Maybe it's always existed. So I think oftentimes we get drunk on language, to borrow an expression from one of my colleagues. I think that we get confused about things that simply aren't confusing. So to answer your question about so say your question again.
Sure. How would you respond to the question that truth is opaque? So to put it in the context of our discussion, for a professor, a philosophy professor, or any professor to get up in front of a classroom in certain disciplines and on certain subjects and say, this is the right way to think, and you should leave this classroom believing this way, as opposed to, say, weighing other evidence or looking at all positions. How would you respond to that type of argument?
Okay. Again, forget about this is the truth. Think about, are there better ways of figuring this problem out than others? Are there so in order to answer that question, think about this. Are there worse ways to answer this question than others? We want to figure out how big the how old the Earth is, or we want to figure out how the distance between a certain star. Are there worse ways to answer this question? Yes. Put a pizza in the oven, time it for 45 minutes, and then count the number of bubbles on the cheese at the end. Yeah, there are worse ways of answering this question. And once we admit that there are worse ways of answering the question, then we can also say that there are better ways of answering the question. Science is a better way to answer the question. And so conclusions that people come about as a result of processes that are unreliable should thus not be allowed into the discourse. And we should not be afraid to call people out on these conclusions and on the processes that were behind people arriving at these. So in terms of whether or not truth is opaque, well, yeah, so there are many things that we don't know. There are many things that we can't know. But here's what we do know. We do know that there are bad ways of thinking about problems, and we do know that there are good ways of thinking about problems. That should be incredibly uncontroversial.
Right. So again, you're going to focus on process. You're going to focus on method rather than saying this is the absolute truth about any subject. You're going to focus more on how did the person arrive at the conclusion they arrived at.
Yeah, and it's so funny, those inside higher ed comments, and maybe it was me, I just wasn't clear enough in the article. Everybody kept talking about the conclusions that one comes to. It's not about the conclusion. It's about the process. And our job as philosophers, or at least the way I look at my job, is to actually go sit down and look at certain processes. Now, look, it could be entirely the case that the process that I'm using to arrive at my conclusions is not reliable. And so I would be incredibly grateful if someone could correct that process so that I would myself be able to more closely align my views lawfully with reality.
Right, and that's where I think philosophy is so powerful. It almost built into the discipline is the requirement that you question your own assumptions, that you look at every aspect of a problem, and you continue to work at those problems until you get closer to the truth. Of course, science does too, but my own view is that science is good at that because it borrows the principles of philosophy.
Yeah.
How would you characterize your epistemology? Would you call yourself a rationalist?
I don't like any of those terms. I like to keep it extremely simple. I don't have any classification of my epistemology. I believe on the basis of evidence. It's just that simple.
Okay. Let's talk about your speech again. I want to return to that because you apparently made some interesting claims there, and your position is also very interesting. The article in the Oregonian, which admittedly was fairly sensationalist, but they characterized your position as holding that faith is a kind of cognitive sickness. And, of course, people like Richard Dawkins make similar claims. Dawkins goes further and says that religion spreads in a viral-like way, and it passes from person to person, and that framework needs to be addressed and dealt with. I wanted to see if the way that the Oregonian characterized your position, if that's accurate or not.
It's absolutely correct. I think it is a cognitive sickness, and this gets back to your earlier question of how do you deal with this. My colleagues seem to say, and why they were upset with me, my colleagues seem to think that I'm somehow not promoting critical thinking or science. That's absolutely not the case. In fact, that's my life project. It's not that I'm not promoting these. It's that these things will not allow somebody, or at best, they may nudge people in certain directions in terms of the way that people conceptualize problems. And I argued that we need to treat faith-based claims in exactly the same way that we treat racist claims. They just have no business at the adult table. They should be stigmatized.
Yeah, talk about that a little bit. What does that mean? Why shouldn't they be at the adult table?
Because they're unreliable. They're not predictive. They're not.
And this goes back to that objective-subjective distinction that we were talking about earlier, correct?
Yeah, and so if somebody, and again, I think that people get caught up in the conclusions. And a controversial example that I use let's say that somebody is against homosexual marriage, and you ask them why. Well, what are your reasons for being against it? And they say, well, it's in my book here. Well, that is a faith-based claim. That does not. You're not allowed to sit at the adult table and say that. You can go to the children's table, you can take your book, and you can live in make-believe land, and that's fine. But those sorts of processes should not be allowed into any political process and to any rational deliberation into the adult table. Now, if you want to say, for example, I'm opposed to homosexual marriage, and I say, well, why are you opposed to homosexual marriage? And you say, well, homosexuals are, X times more likely to beat their children than non-homosexuals. Okay, that's fantastic. That's an empirical claim. We can test the claim. As far as I know, I just made that up. There's no
Sure, exactly.
But we don't look in terms of our own political impulses. We look at the claims that people make, and we look to see if those claims are somehow testable. And then regardless of the conclusion, no matter what we find about homosexuals beating their children or what have you, those claims then enter into the public policy arena.
Suppose the theist comes and says, well, who are you, Mr. Philosopher, that gets to determine who sits at the adult table and who doesn't? I mean, what if they said, well, we believe that we theists have the authority from God, and we should be the ones setting policy. We should be the ones at the adult table, and the rationalists, the people that use logic, should be relegated to the child's table. How do you deal with those kinds of responses?
Well, the response to that depends on the context. There's no one response that one can give. But one thing you need to do is you have to ask people if they believe things because they think that they're true or because it makes them feel good. It's difficult. It would be difficult to address that, more difficult to address. It would be more complicated to address that. You have to do more intellectual work. And you'd have to presuppose that the other person had done more intellectual work if they say that they believe things because it makes them feel good. If they say that they believe things because it's true, well, then again, that's a different set of guidelines. You can predict those, you can see if they're predictable, you can test those, and then you can just point out the fact that even within Christianity, for example, the different faith traditions make different claims.
Right.
So how do we know which of those claims to let in?
Right. Richard Dawkins says something like, every theist is an atheist about every God but one, and he just goes one further.
That's exactly correct.
Let's talk about your work with prisoners in the prison system. You've done some interesting things there, and you've written some what I think are fascinating pieces for how you can apply philosophy to those contexts. You wrote an article for the Journal of Correctional Education titled Socratic Pedagogy, Critical Thinking, and Inmate Education. I'm wondering what your view is on the role of the Socratic method. Do you think that that's a good way to do philosophy just as a general rule? And then how did you apply the Socratic method to your work with prisoners?
Well, those are takes a while to unpack those.
Sure.
I think when people make philosophical claims, that often philosophy is it's untethered from reality. It's unhinged as a discipline, and so I don't even think one can make those claims unless one tests those claims and then looks at the conclusions and then uses those conclusions to, again, guide one's belief to make accurate judgments about certain behaviors or actions. From my experience, and again, this is anecdotal experience, but I tried to translate that into a study in which I did with inmates. Unfortunately, the Department of Corrections would not let me track recidivism at that time. Mm-hmm. I think times are changing, and that will be different. So to answer your question, I believe that the Socratic method could be an adjunct treatment or kind of an adjunct modality to help inmates. Currently, inmates are offered this suite of what's called programming, and they have cognitive behavioral therapy or different sorts of approaches. I think that the Socratic method can help people, can give people ways to think about problems that are seemingly intractable. It can help people impose upon themselves a way to become more rational, a way to make better decisions. Unfortunately, what's happening now is faith-based groups are going into prisons in large scale, and they're trying to convince people that their particular holy book or their particular faith tradition is the tradition that that inmates should use, and virtually nobody goes in and teaches ways to think through problems, ways to think through issues, kind of scientific ways of reasoning, Socratic method. I think that those ways of thinking about problems are incredibly helpful, and they're incredibly empowering for inmates.
In the article, you did note some interesting results that you saw kind of immediately. I know you said that you really couldn't do any follow-up, but even while the class was going on, you said you saw the inmates changing the way that they think. In fact, there was one story there where you said one inmate would make a claim, and then other inmates would start to question that claim and really start to drill down in just the right ways to get to the root of the question.
I did, and I had outcomes assessments. I had instruments that I used, and other people objectively evaluated those instruments and judged it to be successful. People did. I thought my hypothesis was somewhat incorrect. I thought that they would generate more options to problems. They didn't generate more options to problems. In fact, they generated in a couple instances actually fewer options, but they generated much better options to problems.
Yeah, interesting.
So they were, it is super interesting. They were less violent and less reactive and more thoughtful in their responses. Again, this is judged by external evaluators.
Of course. Let's go back to the critical thinking component for a moment. In another article that you wrote entitled Mambo Dogfish, I think that was the name.
That's Steve Martin's phrase.
Yeah, right. In that article, which if it's not widely read, it should be, you say, critical thinking cannot arise when subjectivity or an individual learner's personal experiences are privileged over an objectively knowable world and public rules of language use. And there you seem to be saying that critical thinking can't even take place, can't even arise when someone prioritizes their subjective experiences over what we might call objective knowledge or objective truth claims.
That's right. There has to be some corrective mechanism. You have to have the possibility of being wrong. And the only way that you can have the possibility of being wrong is if there's a shared metaphysic, if there's a stable, objective, independent reality. And so, and again, I think that this is one of the reasons that my leftist secular colleagues are upset with me. Leftism, to a certain extent, allowed this, coupled with other social and intellectual turns, was responsible for the subjective turn. And so this idea then that subjectivity takes primacy over an objectively knowable world, my experience is just as good as yours, this led to not only types of relativism, but it opened up a window for things like intelligent design to weasel their way into the system. It opened up a window for different people's quote-unquote perceptions of reality to have a seat at the adult table and to be viewed and then further institutionalized.
Yeah, in fact, you talk about that in Mambo Dogfish. You have a section in there on epistemic constructivism, and that section really resonated with me because I have some good friends that are postmodernists and existentialists, and essentially they say there is no privileged access to the world. There is no meta narrative. That's the language they use, and there's no way that we could justify any approach to the world. So, for example, if you said that logic and reason are the way that we get to truth, there's no logical or reasonable or evidential argument that you could make that would justify that. So in a sense, all of us take a leap of faith. Would you say that constructivism and postmodernism, in the way that I just kind of defined it, would you say that they're similar? And is your criticism of constructivism, would it apply equally to postmodernism?
Yeah, it's interesting. There are certain elements at play. They're almost like cognitive toxins. They're just undermining reliable processes that one can use to get to the truth. Constructivism as a pedagogical practice, and not all constructivism falls into these categories. I mentioned in, I think, another paper entitled Behaviorism, Constructivism, and Socratic Pedagogy. I mentioned that there are different flavors or types of constructivists, but at its essence, again, it's this idea of privileging subjectivity. It's the idea that one person's process is just as good as another person's process. And that opens spaces socially and culturally for conclusions that come about as a result of unreliable processes to gain traction. And you can see that, for example, I get back to the homosexual thing. I remember reading when the gay anti-gay marriage initiative was on the ballot, I read the book. Was an enormous book. In Oregon here, they send the voters' guides to your house, and I remember reading that, and virtually every single argument, page after page after page after page, was based upon biblical, what the Bible said, or what someone's faith tradition said. Well, those are unreliable processes.
Yeah.
So they're not. They ought not to be. I mean, anybody can use any process of reasoning that they want. Just don't claim that it's true, because once you start making truth claims about things, then you're in a whole new world. Like, you can say, well, I like to use the process of flipping coins, or I go to Vegas and watch people rub their hands over the slot machines because it makes me feel good. And somehow people think that translates, making them feel good translates into, well, it's just true for me. It's over the machine, and then more money is going to come out.
So you wouldn't deny that the use of reason is a leap of faith. It's just misused in some contexts more than others.
There's more to okay.
Categorically, emphatically deny it. It's not even a sense of denial. I just say that that's not true. It depends what one means by faith. It depends how one uses the word faith. And it's not a leap of faith, because we know that I mean, look, people live every day as if they should guide their beliefs by evidence. They don't wake up in the morning and say, well, today I've decided in my particular tradition that cars, don't really hit you. You can just walk right through them. I think Bertrand Russell's example is when you bite into an apple, you don't expect it to taste like roast beef. So we live our lives every day according to, maybe one could call it induction, that the past resemble the future. We live according to rational precepts and precepts. We also live according to evidence rules our lives for most things. Most people, that's the case. But we make these special exemptions for faith-based beliefs. And I'm saying that those ought not to be exemptions.
So in a sense, reason proves itself pragmatically. I mean, if a person prays every day that God would fill their belly and rely only on that, they'd be dead soon, right?
I don't have faith every time I get in an airplane it will fly.
Yeah.
I believe that every time I get in an airplane it will fly on the basis of the evidence.
Right.
And the basis of the science, and the basis of the process that allowed the airplane to come into existence in the first place. You wouldn't get in the plane and fly if it were constructed on a faith-based process, would you?
No, I don't believe I would.
Okay.
I want to come back to this question of faith. I have one more question, and I want to frame it in terms of the faith issue, mainly because this is a large part of how you frame your discussion, at least in the article. Richard Dawkins is characterized, or maybe a better, more accurate term is caricatured, but he's characterized as someone who wants to eradicate faith. He thinks that it's something that we as a society should get rid of. And I recall, I think it was in The God Delusion, and again, this is from memory, so I'm not exactly sure how accurate it is. But I think he said that if we were allowed to inculcate reasonable arguments in children from a young age, and we meaning society, if society could kind of control that early education from the ground up, that faith would be eradicated within 2 generations, that it just wouldn't hold up if children were taught that from a young age. Is that your position? Are you someone that wants to get rid of faith? Do you think it should be eradicated from society? And do you think that would be a good thing? Do you think it's even possible?
Well, that's incredibly optimistic, 2 generations. I don't know if it's possible. That's an empirical question. There's increasing evidence now that suggests that faith itself is a byproduct or process, or it has some neurological basis. So again, that's outside my area. For that, you'd have to ask somebody who specializes in neuroscience. Is my goal to eliminate faith? That's a difficult question. I don't know look, here's my goal. My goal is to help people think through problems. My goal is to teach people that certain ways of thinking about whatever issues that they're confronting, problems, practical problems they have in their lives, they're just not going to cut it. They're just not reliable. And I think, as Christopher Hitchens says, philosophy offers people the opportunity to live a life free of illusion. At its best, I think that's exactly what philosophy offers people.
Yeah, that's a good word. Maybe another way to put it is that you don't want to eradicate faith per se, but you want to focus on the method, you want to focus on the process that people use to get to those faith-based conclusions. And if people are thinking in the right way, if they're using the right method, they're using the right process, then the products will go away by themselves.
Yeah, yes, well said. But I also want people to understand why it's important to use methods of reason and evidence. I mean, if you want to make your life better, your society better, your community better, it's not any conclusion that comes about as a result of a faith-based process is arbitrary. It's just not going to cut it for you. It's not going to do it. So people need to understand why they need to use the tools of science. They also have to have an attitudinal disposition towards these things. You know, the willingness to revise a belief, a trustfulness of reason, and even the willingness to revise a process. You know, it could be that it could totally be possible. I'd love to see what it is, but that the scientific method itself could be improved upon, or somebody can come up with something better, and then we have to be willing to take a look at that. So it's that people have to have a fundamental understanding of what process they can use to think about the world to make their lives better and everyone else's lives better. And the process that will not do this is faith. It will not help you to reach reliable conclusions, and thus it should be jettisoned. But people need to really fundamentally understand that, not in some kind of behavioral condition we do what people have in their house, but people really need to understand why it's not a reliable way of arriving at the truth. I think if we can teach people that, it will always be there because it could be hardwired in our brains, but the problem will more or less take care of itself. And then faith-based claims will have less influence in the public policy arena.
My guest today has been Peter Boghossian. Thank you for joining us today, Peter.
Thank you.